But to me, it's okay that they think those things, because the way someone thinks about me, I don't have a problem with that. My main thing is I would never want someone to think that I would hurt Gannon or any of the children in our home, because that's just not the case.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. So it may seem a pretty silly question even to say, will Harley testify for or against her mom? But we're going to look at this from two points of view. The one is what has already happened. In other words, what behavior in the past can we base this on in terms of Harley and Letecia, right? And then the other aspect, which I think is really interesting, is we're going to look at quite a few other high-profile cases where there was some testimony, some surprising, some not surprising, where family members testified for or against or didn't testify at all. And we're going to just look at that within the context of what's going on here. And I certainly found it interesting putting that together. So let's start off by just looking at the obvious in terms of the mother-daughter relationship. There's basically three areas where we already get a very strong, explicit, clear indication of what's going to happen in the future. They say the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? I guess that's also true with pandemics. Anyway, in terms of Letecia and Harley, Harley's already testified for Letecia in the sense of when Letecia gave her sermon on the verge, on the side of the road, when she was speaking to Spencer Wilson, I think his name, the reporter. At one point she sort of said, well, I can have my daughter verify where I was. I think she was talking about coming home from the hike on the Sunday afternoon or evening, that Gannon was with them and he was safe and everything was fine. And in that instance, she kind of called her daughter, and Harley sort of came out, and you can kind of overhear her saying something like, "Do you want me to say I saw him?" or something like that. But Letecia kind of tells her what to say, and then that's basically what Harley does. And she kind of just says that, and then she exits the frame, and her mother continues. So that is what we can kind of expect in the future, is a kind of a situation where Harley's going to jump when her mother says jump, I expect. That's the one thing. The other thing is Harley participated in the cover-up of the crime, it appears, not intentionally and not knowingly, but she certainly played her part in terms of, in the affidavit, mentions Letecia asking her daughter to go and fetch her carpet cleaner and all sorts of other things, and Harley duly did that, right? There's also the mention in the affidavit where Letecia asks Harley to come pick her up at Powers and Carefree at that intersection, and I think that was the night of stuck with the Watts case, the night of January the 28th, so the same night that the body was disposed of. We don't actually know where Letecia parked her Tiguan that night. I mean, that morning it was parked in airport parking, but the cross-section of the intersection of Powers and Carefree is somewhere away from the airport, so presumably she parked it somewhere else. There are quite a few parking centres or strip malls and so on at that particular area. I did go and check that up. I did go and research that when I wrote Boy Interrupted, and speculated about a couple of different sites where she may have left the car overnight. and also where she may have waited for Harley to pick her up, where she would have parked. Also looked into that. In any event, so Harley is kind of quite reliable in terms of that. And then the third aspect is that Harley hasn't spoken to law enforcement. And in quite a few disappearing cases, from John Benet Ramsey to the fairly recent Nora Corrin case in Malaysia, to this one as well, but often when you have a situation where a family member disappears, your best witnesses, I'm talking about where a family member disappears from the home, or a kind of a home scenario, even if they were on holiday. But the point being, when a family member disappears, and it's like, well, what happened to that person? It's important to speak to everyone in the family, the parents, but also the siblings. And when you have a situation where one of the siblings, and in this sense Harley is like a step sibling, like a step sister, isn't talking to the law enforcement, isn't speaking to investigators, there is often reason then to be suspicious. Because what are they going to be talking about? Are they going to be talking about dysfunction in the home? Are they going to be talking about the sleeping arrangements? Are they going to be talking about arguments? Are they going to be talking about, what are they going to say that someone doesn't want to hear? And potentially put someone into the crosshairs of, the prosecution or law enforcement. And as far as we know, Harley hasn't been questioned. She hasn't spoken to law enforcement. Certainly not at the time of that arrest affidavit, not arrest affidavit, just the affidavit. So based on that, it looks like Harley will be there for her mother at the trial, presumably if it commences in June, right? Now we're going to look at other cases, and I want to start with Patrick Frazee. So with Patrick Frazee, you also had a situation where someone was missing for a long time. Nobody really seemed to know, and there didn't seem to be much help coming from anybody in terms of the deceased in that case, who was Kelsey Bereth. Who would have known, or who could have guessed that in that particular case, you potentially had two witnesses seeing the body disposed of besides the perpetrator himself? One being the mistress, as it happened, Crystal Kenny, who was present when the body was transported and when it was incinerated, right? So you can have a situation like that where there is a witness in that respect. Number two, Frazee's mother sort of stepped out onto the porch and when he was burning Kelsey's body, and apparently wasn't very curious and didn't try to find out what was going on. And she didn't testify at all in the Patrick Frazee case. Neither did he, for that matter. In fact, I don't think there were any witnesses. The defense didn't really call anybody in the Patrick Frazee case. It was basically just a defense case, pouring cold water on everything the prosecution said. But in another way of looking at it, in the Frazee trial, there was basically no defense case in terms of witnesses testifying and all that kind of thing, right? Which was kind of surprising. But I think the most important aspect was the people closest to Frazee didn't testify. His mother didn't testify, and neither did Crystal Kenny testified against him, put it that way. So, and then the part that I think is worth mentioning with Frazee is his brother did testify. His brother's Sean, and they kind of look very similar, although I think Sean's got a moustache. And Sean is a law enforcement officer in Colorado Springs. And so this guy testified against his brother, but it has to be said, very kind of wishy-washy. It wasn't helping his brother, what Sean Frazee said, but it certainly wasn't smoking gun kind of thing. And there was also definitely something going on between the brothers. Number one, we knew they were estranged, that was sort of known. But also, when the one brother got off the stand, he sort of looked back and rolled his eyes. And so that told you that there was something, some dynamic going on between the two, right? In the Jodi Arias trial, Jodi Arias has got brothers and sisters and so on. As far as I can recall, only her mother testified in support of her, and besides her mother, there certainly wasn't a long laundry list of people queuing up to testify in her defense. There were a couple of people, just not that many. Interestingly, in the Casey Anthony case, you kind of had family members stepping up and backing up Casey Anthony. Her mother and father both testified, kind of in a way that was sort of good for Casey Anthony, wouldn't you say? I mean, Casey. I'm not necessarily saying that they were supporting their daughter explicitly, but indirectly their testimony certainly helped Casey Anthony. And her mother certainly said things that kind of helped Casey quite a lot, just that she did the searches on the computer. She was looking for how to make chloroform to get the dog to stop barking, crazy stuff like that, and so on and so on. So you kind of had a general vibe from Cindy Anthony that they were sort of, they thought that their daughter was innocent, put it that way. And that is an aspect that's often quite surprising, is we will look at the case from our perspective, whoever it is, and we'll kind of say, wow, it's pretty clear what's going on here. It's pretty clear that this person did that. And then you might think, well, anybody close to them would know that as well. Anybody close to them would be very aware of how things look, and it's just not the case. When people are in a family, there are other dynamics and other overriding things and other influences, and they may not be aware of realities, in inverted commas, the way that we are. In fact, they may be aware of other realities that are either not true or that are truer than the realities we know. In other words, they just are in a different reality to ours, and sometimes it's quite surprising and sometimes it's not. In the Oscar Pistorius case, none of his family members testified on his behalf, and they were in trial constantly. He had a big support base. So his brother didn't testify on his behalf. His sister, who was howling and crying in court, didn't testify on his behalf. His father didn't testify on his behalf. His uncle, who he stayed with, didn't testify on his behalf. So all these people that were there simply didn't testify on his behalf. In the end, I think it was some lady testified kind of for him. I can't quite remember their relationship, but it wasn't. Anyway, it's even difficult to remember who did testify on his behalf, but it was like one person, right? With the Henry van Breda case, that was really interesting, because there you had a family murder. You had a guy axe-murdering his parents and his elder brother, and then he'd also used the axe on his younger sister, but without killing her. So she was very close to death, but didn't die, survived. And then the question was she going to testify against him, this guy, this brother, not a stepbrother, her blood brother? Was she going to testify against him? And that was a very big question, because it seemed like the verdict and it seemed like a lot was going to hinge on what she was going to say. And what I think surprised everybody, a lot of people thought she would testify for the prosecution against him, but then there was speculation that she might be called as a defense witness. And then ultimately, she didn't testify at all. And from a legal perspective, that made a lot of sense, because she stood to inherit something like $10 million or so. She stood to inherit that fortune, whereas if he was found guilty, they stood to share the inheritance. Sorry, if he was found innocent, they stood to share that inheritance. Of course, if he was found guilty, then she would get everything, which ultimately did happen. But if she had testified, or if she hadn't, if she had testified for either side, I'm just thinking about something else. She could have been implicated in a struggle over the money, where if she testified against him, they could have argued that she was doing it for the money, and if she testified for him, there could also be an argument that she was doing it with some kind of weird objective. And so, just to make absolutely sure she inherited what she was supposed to inherit, the sound legal argument was just don't get involved at all, which is what she did. She didn't testify, and so she stands to inherit everything. And she, at the time she was a minor, so I think she's reached the age where she could have inherited what she needed to. But when you add that dynamic, it's quite interesting as well. And then the third aspect is Jason Rode is a South African criminal, a guy who was a father to 3 daughters, accused of murdering his wife, found guilty of murdering his wife, and then his daughter was going to testify on his behalf. She was called as a defense witness, and then ultimately didn't show up. So she was going to. So think of it like this: you have one of your parents accused of murdering the other parent, and then you are called as a defense witness for the prime suspect in the murder of your other parent. But the parent that is still alive is your guardian, and also has a lot of money. He's a multimillionaire, and they were at school and at university when the crime happened. So what happens if you testify against your father? Or who's going to take care of you then? So you had this really weird mixture of dynamics going on. And so when you ask the question, you say, well, surely they must know he's guilty. No, it's not necessarily like that. It's not necessarily that they know. They want to believe that they're not, right? They choose to believe that they're not. In any event, I think Harley's testimony, if she does testify, is going to be some of the most riveting testimony of the trial. And we have yet to see whether Letecia will testify. I somehow suspect she will. I don't think it would be good. I think she would do so against legal advice, but I just get the sense that she would want to speak for herself just because she's been doing it all along. So, she would give yet another story compared to all the stories she's already given. So we'll see what happens. Okay, I'm not going to take it further than that. I still want to look at Peter Hyatt's statement analysis. I have also contacted the reporter, Spencer Wilson, just with a question I had when I was writing the book, which was, I know that at the same day that they had this interview, she drove to the disposal site, and so I really wanted to know what time was this interview, how long did it last, and kind of where was it as well. So we'll see if he answers that. Okay, thank you for listening. Wherever you are in the world, take care, hold it together, and guys, I'll see you next time.